Good morning, everyone. Is it February already? Oh, I could have snoozed until April. Oh well, time to leave the arms of Morpheus. No, not that one. No, not that other one either. The other one. The sleep one, you know. The innocent sleep. Sleep that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get the year started. Now, where's my button? Ah, there you are. Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by your humble narrator, Kristin Holland. Oh, it's lovely to be back with you again. We have a cracking little tale with which we'll be kicking off proceedings this year, from a writer who is not only a previous contributor to the show, but is also a beloved patron of our humble production. Speaking of patrons, look, would somebody please shut that bloody orchestra up? Thank you. Speaking of patrons, let's see if anyone new has joined the ranks while we slumbered. What's this? My, oh my, we have 2 new cohorts, that very highest of tiers amongst our Patreon subscribers. Who are these magnificent co-conspirators? Fox meets Bear and Philip Abruzese. Welcome. And look, there's a whole batch of new acolytes who've stormed the gates with you. Francisco Redfez, Tea Time in Hell, Janice Sigmund, Oliver Zombie, Brooke Bourre, Killjoy, Andrew Soto, STFU Donny, NPC. Big Lebowski fan by any chance? Aren't we all? And Megan Ward. Welcome, my dears. I do hope our exclusive Patreon subscriber stories kept you amused during our little hiatus. Well, as far as I can see, our humble narrator has been very industrious since Transmismas. Just look at all the lovely things he's been preparing for you. You lucky ducks. Good things come to those that wait. And now, our first transmission for 2022. A deliciously dark little drama from the poison pen of Pamela McMillan. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Pamela McMillan's The Whale Hunts. Henry leaned over the side of the powerful yacht and stared down at the inky waters of the midnight sea. Behind him, Louis and Elena were checking the harpoon chest in the middle of the ship, repacking the harpoons so that they would be easy to grab. Henry could see the receding light of the city of New York, too. He looked back at the thick, black waters. Henry reckoned that they were above the sunken city of New York 1, lost in the cataclysm of 2071. Elena came up to his side. She would have been beautiful if her face hadn't been disfigured by the acid her husband had thrown at her after she fled their marriage with their young daughter. "Anything?" she asked. "Oh, we wouldn't see it even if it was down there. No one's seen it properly. The water's too dark," he said. Elena shrugged and smiled. The smile made her mass of scar tissue scrunch up in thick wrinkles. Henry wondered if it hurt her to smile. "Nothing on radar," Captain Richardson called from the helm. No one knew the captain's real name. When he'd first met the convicts, he'd refused to shake their hands or introduce himself. He just sucked on his pipe and looked them all up and down before nodding and letting them pass on their way onto the ship. Elena started calling him Captain Richardson, and everyone else followed suit. He had never bothered to correct them. He wasn't one of them. He was rich, bored, and desperate for something to make his life more interesting. The fading ring of lighter skin on his left ring finger marked him as a widower or divorcee. Henry assumed that the captain liked the excitement and danger of the hunt, of being one of the few free men allowed to sail the Black Sea. Henry had never bothered to ask the captain if this was true. He knew the old man would never answer. "Are we above New York, Captain?" he asked instead. The grey old man scratched at the white whiskers on his chin and snorted around his pipe. "Above New York, you say? I'd say we left the Surrey sunken bitch a mile back. We're in the proper Atlantic now, son." The heavy British accent he had was questionable, since it tended to fade when the captain was distracted. "Captain, harpoons are set!" Louis shouted. Henry shivered a bit in the cold wind that picked up off the dark water. It smelled sour and rotten. He zipped up his windbreaker and looked out over the water. He'd been on over 24 hunts, 12 trips for every murder. But each time felt as terrifying as the last. Most criminals managed to survive their sentences without a single sighting or encounter with the whale. Of course, those that did encounter it simply disappeared, boat and all. Louis, Elena, and Henry joined the captain at the helm. The captain pulled a gold cross from under his thin button-up and held it out so it dangled in his fist at the end of a thick gold chain. One by one, the 3 convicts placed their left hands on top of his fist. "Lend us your strength, O Lord, that we 4 might slay the great Leviathan that struck so deadly a blow to our hallowed nation. Guide us through this dark night over the Black Sea and into the dawn. Guide our spears true. And if it is your plan, O Lord, to sink us low, let us each die with glory and courage in our hearts." The captain intoned. "Amen," said the rest obediently. The captain nodded and tucked his cross away. The 3 convicts descended back onto the main deck and took their positions. Elena was at the starboard harpoon gun, Louis at the port, and Henry at the gun bolted to the very front of the ship. Henry looked over his shoulder. Fierce, crazed Louis was grinning. He'd be sailing the hunt until the day he died of old age after shooting up his high school graduation ceremony. His shaven head gleamed in the light of the thin sickle moon and was crowned with a blotchy tattoo of twin snakes entwined and spitting red venom. Elena had tied back her thick, curly brown hair with a rubber band. Her marred face was serene and calm. This was to be her last hunt. She had been lucky. She had only managed to put her husband into intensive care after she'd tried to kill him with a hammer. For aggravated assault, convicts only had to serve an abbreviated sentence on the Black Sea. The captain looked as relaxed as he always did on the water. The thin moon was hanging above his head like an Egyptian halo. His tarry teeth were out in full view as he clenched his old pipe between them, his faded blue sailor's hat tilted back on his balding head at a jaunty angle. Henry wondered, not for the first time, how much of the captain's persona was affected to emulate an ideal of the stereotypical swarthy pirate captain of old. "Keep your eyes on the sea, son," the captain shouted at him. Henry nodded and blushed a bit when he caught Elena looking his way. He settled back in his hard plastic lawn chair and peered out over the water for any signs of movement. The Black Sea was as dead as ever, void of even a ripple or wave. Henry leaned over the salt-eaten railing. Reaching out, he dipped his fingers into the icy waters. The Atlantic Ocean used to be all blues and greens and greys, but never black. That had all changed the day of the cataclysm. The whole eastern coast of the United States and Canada had been hit by a massive earthquake. The violence of the tremors had been off the charts. The cataclysm happened overnight. No warning, no chance to escape. So countless thousands of people had died when the cities had come crashing down around their heads. New York, Rhode Island, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Florida had all been lost. Whole cities had been swallowed by the earth and waves. Rising from the ocean, tsunamis had appeared as roaring giants, pounding the remaining coastlines as thousands of people fled inland. After a day of terror, the waves calmed, and only the aftershocks remained. That and the dark stain that appeared off the coastline, a mile from where New York City used to be. Scientists from all around the world guessed that this was where the earthquake had originated. So the government sent a team to investigate. All 7 of the divers disappeared. The only record left was one of the underwater cameras that had resurfaced miles away, caught by a net. The footage showed the divers descending into the indigo depths and towards the mysterious inky blob that clung to the ocean floor. The divers spread out, aimed their flashlights into the darkness, and swam into it. The camera's view darkens, and that's it. "Eyes on the sea, Henry, unless you want to end up as whale food," the captain shouted over the sound of the engine. Henry jerked his hand out of the water and shook his head. He hadn't realized that he had tuned out. He sat back in his seat. The yacht sliced through the thick waters, spraying the air with salty droplets. The mist freckled Henry's face as he peered into the night. Out of reflex, he licked his lips and immediately regretted it. The water tasted foul. Gone was the clean and bitter taste of salt and seaweed. After the dark stain had appeared, all the marine life had died, and as the ocean had died, the stain grew larger and larger. The water tasted of feces, old coffee grounds, and rotting fruit. It smelled even worse, hot and musky and overpowering. After 3 years, the whole eastern coast was changed, from the shoreline to over 40 miles out. The Black Sea showed no signs of slowing its growth, and the foul water stretched farther and farther. The fishing industry died with the ocean. Of course, people began to claim sightings of the whale hunting. They blamed it for eating all the fish. Henry had heard all the theories. The whale was an ancient apex predator stirred up out of the depths after the cataclysm, or that it was a giant squid drawn up due to overfishing, or a long-necked dinosaur enraged by the oil drilling. Whatever it was, Henry was confident that the heavy steel harpoons they had would pierce its damned hide. The night was quiet. The captain took them right up to where the black waters ended and the clean blue ocean began. He cut off the engine so they could all have something to eat and drink before making the long journey back. Henry looked down at the 2 bodies of water that met so calmly together. The border between was perfectly straight and even. Alina called to him, and he joined her and Louis. The 3 convicts sat in a loose ring by Alina's harpoon gun. Alina always brought something home-cooked, spicy and fragrant. This night it was a simple chickpea and carrot curry on jasmine rice. Henry had brought some ham and cheese sandwiches. Crazy Louis always brought the same thing, a small jar of sweet pickles. Captain Richardson never ate anything with them. Whether it was because he thought himself above them or because he wanted to keep an eye on the ocean at all times, Henry didn't know. The captain not only refused to eat any of their food, he also never brought any of his own. Every night he would lean back against the railing, stare up at the sky, and smoke his pipe. Louis had already cracked open his jar of pickles and was taking a deep swallow of the yellow brine. Alina had waited for Henry before bowing her head in prayer. Henry closed his eyes and waited for her to finish. The first time Alina had done this, he'd felt uncomfortable and out of place. If there was a god, he obviously didn't care enough to stop the whale from slowly killing the ocean and starving the United States. Over a few days, Henry got used to it. She never asked him to pray along with her, or for Louis to refrain from eating until she was done. So Henry closed his eyes and listened. The captain always set his anchor down so that his yacht sat half in the ocean and half in the Black Sea. The waves from each had their own sound. The ocean sounded soft, light and gentle. The waves of the Black Sea were harsher, thicker, and sucked the side of the ship in greedy slurps. "Amen," Alina said, and opened the big thermos of curry. She poured the steaming food into the bowls of rice she had already prepared. Henry passed out a sandwich to everyone. Louis didn't offer anyone a pickle. "Why do you drink the brine?" Henry asked, finally, after weeks of wondering. The wild-eyed young man shrugged one shoulder. "Maybe if I've drunk enough, I'll become pickled," Louis said. "What?" Henry said. "Well, don't want no pickle. You'll be wanting the fresh food." Louis grinned a rotting smile. Henry looked over at Alina. She smiled and shrugged in imitation of Louis. How's your daughter?" Henry asked, trying to ignore Louis' slurps. Alina put down her sandwich. She reached into an inside pocket of her bright yellow jacket and pulled out a twice-folded sheet of computer paper. She took great care in unfolding it to reveal a crude crayon drawing featuring bright colors. The drawing was of a woman and a little girl. Henry took it and looked at it a moment. He couldn't remember what it was like to be a kid. "Very cute," he said, handing it back. "The probation officer was there the whole time, but we still had fun," Alina said. "He hasn't touched her. I can tell. She finally looks happy." Alina's smile was sweet, but also strained with a subtle sorrow. "And you, Henry? How are you?" Henry made a Louis shrug. "The dating game's been sparse, being a criminal and all. I'm afraid the Black Sea smell doesn't help either." Louis giggled. "Time to head back," the captain called. The 3 convicts packed away their leftovers and returned to their posts. The captain turned the engine on full. The yacht cut through the water, and the captain aimed her back home. Henry looked for the moon's reflection in the surface of the Black Sea, but couldn't find it. It didn't reflect any kind of light. It was just a monotone, smooth black. He'd never noticed that before, how the reflections were missing. He looked up at the moon hanging over the western horizon like a waiting bone sickle. The yacht shuddered to a stop. Henry was pitched forward. Only by grabbing the harpoon gun was he able to prevent himself from going overboard. Pushing himself back off the gun, he turned around. Alina was sprawled on her belly on the deck. Louis was gripping the railing with white knuckles. The captain was gone. The yacht's engine was still growling, the water frothing behind it as its blades kicked up waves, but the ship wasn't moving forward. It was bucking from side to side, but otherwise remained in the same place. Henry spread his legs for better balance and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Captain!" he called. "I think he fell overboard." Alina was getting to her feet. "Well, got him," Louis said. Henry took a few steps towards the man. His heart kicked up into his throat. "You saw him get taken? You saw the whale?" he asked. The man shook his shaven head, pressed a finger against the side of his nose, and snorted phlegm into the water. "Didn't see it. I smelt it," he said. "What do you mean, you smelled the damn whale?" Henry's voice pitched high in his fear. "It smelled like fresh blood." The 2 men stared at each other. Henry looked away first, the other man's eyes wild and blank. Keeping his gaze on the slippery deck, Henry joined Alina at the helm. She was turning the wheel, fiddling with the throttle. "It won't move, it's like it's stuck," she said. "The anchor. Maybe the captain forgot to bring it back up," Henry countered. Louis giggled, drawing their eyes to him as he pointed down at the anchor at the aft side of the yacht. Henry felt his palms begin to tingle, something that always happened when he knew things were about to take a turn for the worse. His palms had tingled when he had seen on the evening news 2 months earlier that the plant he worked at had exploded, killing 63 people and injuring dozens more. His palms had tingled when he heard that the investigators had found signs of negligence. That's how Henry had known it was his fault. He'd been the night foreman the shift before the explosion. He'd been the one to sign off on the checklist. He'd been the one to miss the engineer's note about the leaking valve and the request to replace it. His palms had tingled in the courtroom, and Henry had known the judge would declare him guilty on all counts. The next day he was assigned a place in the Whale Hunter's Lodge, a maximum security prison just outside the city. A week for every man killed. 63 weeks. 13 months in total. Now, his palms were tingling again. "Can you get this boat moving, Elena?" he asked. The woman shook her head. "It has to be caught on something. A reef?" "Not possible. All the reefs died with the fish and the goddamn seaweed." The yacht shook violently and heaved up out of the water before splashing back down. "Get to your harpoon stations!" Henry barked. He scrambled over the wet deck, flinging himself onto his gun. A small patch of water on the starboard side burst up as a thick black tentacle rose into the air. The water ran thickly down its length. It stretched 15 feet high, waving. Henry jerked his harpoon gun to the right, aimed and squeezed the trigger. The steel harpoon speared right through the tentacle, shooting out the other side and landing in the sea to sink out of sight. Unharmed, the tentacle dropped towards them. Louis screamed as he saw it, but didn't have time to dive out of the way. The force of the impact splattered him across the deck in gobs and crimson rain. Henry felt some of Louis's hot blood mist over his face, like the black water had done earlier. He could taste Louis's saltiness, and wondered for a brief, insane moment if he could taste pickles. Elena was screaming, her hands turning her gun to aim true. Henry heard her harpoon launch. The sea bulged all around them. 6 more giant tentacles breached the surface to weave through the air. They were surrounded. Elena struggled to reload her weapon. He watched her aim and fire. He stood, frozen. The yacht was listing to port. Elena's harpoon went wild as everything began to slide. The ship was rising as something was ascending to the surface, directly beneath it. Henry fell against the railings, clutched at the corroded metal, and looked over the side at the behemoth under the water. It was massive. Bigger than any whale he'd ever seen. The yacht tilted farther, began to spin as it slid off the giant's back. The yacht's nose plunged into the sea. Its deck was flooded by the foul water before it broke free and righted itself. Elena was screaming again. Henry turned and saw the woman had been swept under the railings. Her legs dangled off the side of the boat. He went to her, his feet slipping in the water and the blood. On the starboard side, the black Goliath rose higher and higher out of the water. There was a meaty pop as a great black eye appeared in the dark. Henry fell to his knees and grabbed Alina's outstretched hand. Her body lay over the side of the yacht, between the deck and underneath the railing. He could hear her tiny feet beating a furious tempo against the side of the ship. Her other hand gripped the vertical support pole of the railing. He braced his feet and pulled. He felt her weight ease, begin to rise. Alina's screams intensified. She beat at his hands with her free one, her nails scrambling at his fingers. He reached down and hooked a hand in her armpit for more leverage. "Let go!" she screamed. Henry looked down at her upturned, terrified face. He looked up. A tentacle was wrapped around her legs and was pulling her legs upwards. He saw her back, bending the wrong way, trapped between him, the whale, and the railing. It was too late. He heard the heavy snap as her spine broke. Her hand went limp in his. He loosened his grip, and the tentacle yanked her away, up into the air, and then straight down underneath the dark waves. The whale's vast head sunk out of sight with her. Henry dove for the harpoon chest. He ignored the harpoons, tossing them onto the deck to roll all over the place. He pulled out a clunky flare gun. It was already loaded. He took careful aim, leveled the muzzle at the nearest tentacle, and fired. The superheated flare struck it dead on and blazed up with an intense burst. Henry could hear the deep sizzle as a thick cloud of steam ascended to the heavens. The tentacle snapped down beneath the water, dousing the flare and disappearing. The yacht began to tilt again as the whale's head broke the surface where the tentacle had been. It towered over the ship. 3 meaty pops, one after the other, as 3 eyes opened on the same side. The alien gaze pierced him to his very core. Out of the corner of his own eye, Henry saw the tentacles press and twist together, becoming one enormous appendage. He didn't want to die. He wasn't a real murderer. It had been an accident. He didn't deserve this. It had been negligence, not murder. Not murder. Henry was moaning senseless apologies as he fumbled through the harpoon chest, trying to find more flares. He did so, blind, unable to tear his gaze away from the terrible stare of the whale. His palms were tingling. His fingers were numb, but he clutched at a single flare. He loaded it into the gun. The single huge tentacle had risen high enough to blot out the moon. Henry raised the gun, closed one eye, and fired. 2 of those soulless eyes were closer to one another than the third. It was between these that the flare struck and ignited. If the intense light and heat hurt the whale in any way, it never made a sound to indicate as such. The 2 eyes burst. Heavy, hot, black ichor doused Henry. The liquid burned his skin, eating away at his clothes and his chest. Behind him, he heard the air whistle as the tentacle came down on him. He threw himself overboard as it crashed onto the deck. The grimy water washed the whale's eye gore away and eased the burning only slightly. A part of Henry's mind wondered at the strange, thick texture of the Black Sea. So different and unnatural compared to the true ocean. In front of him, through the murk, he saw the yacht sinking, cut very nearly in two from the impact. Before his eyes, the ship began to crumple and break apart in the grip of something he could not make out through the gloom. Lungs burning, he kicked at the water, trying to reach the surface. At first, he met resistance. The dark sea was heavy, and it weighed on his limbs, pushing, rejecting his survival with vicious intent. Henry had to fight rather than swim to the surface. Breaking through at last, Henry sucked in a delicious gasp of air. Heart pounding, Henry twisted this way and that, searching for the behemoth. The whale was gone. The Black Sea was still and empty. There wasn't any debris from the yacht even to show where it had been. He treaded water, his mind frozen as to what he should do. He turned himself around and around in circles. The sea was sucking at his legs, pulling at his chest. He was getting tired. Henry stopped turning. Ahead of him he could see the gentle, clean waves of the uninfected ocean. Henry began to swim. The captain had gotten them only a quarter of a mile away from the border between sea and ocean before the whale had caught them. It was a distance that would have been easy to manage, except that the dark water was sucking at him, pushing back to try and keep him away from the ocean. Several times the Black Sea jumped up and plunged into his mouth, choking him. He struggled, his muscles burning with exertion. The dark water rose to meet him. Henry floundered. He couldn't keep his head above the Black Sea. He stopped swimming and treaded the water. It lost sight of the ocean. All he could see was a high wave of darkness. The Black Sea was rising in a thick, slow wall. Henry now knew that the whale meant to keep him, and his palms were screaming with pinpricks. He sucked in a deep breath and plunged beneath the surface. He kicked and clawed and beat at it, pulling himself forward at a snail's pace. His head buzzed, his heart crashed about in his chest between his burning lungs. Still, he kicked his legs, giving everything he had left. Reaching out with his hands, he prayed to feel the lighter, thinner water of the ocean. Henry's gaze grew dark, spotted. The whale began to crush him, squeezing his body as though he was trapped between gelatinous jaws that spanned for miles. Around his legs, he felt something tightening, burning. He screamed, his air streaming away from his face in tiny bubbles. His hand broke through, and he felt cold night air. He felt despair. The darkness had tricked him, and he'd gotten twisted about. He'd been swimming nowhere and upward rather than to safety. Now the whale would have him. Henry's head broke through. He looked and saw the indigo ocean below him. His mind had a moment to recognize that he was hanging out of the whale, 3 feet above where the real ocean line was, before he fell out of the living wall, plunging face first into the water. Caught by surprise, Henry swallowed a bellyful of the salty water. When he broke the surface again, he vomited. With violent groans, he expelled the hot, burning remains of Elena's curry and his cheese sandwiches. Above him, the sickle moon shone on, unchallenged. Bleary-eyed, Henry backpaddled away from his floating island of bile. He kept his back to the open ocean, never taking his eyes away from the black sea. His legs were stinging, as if they'd been burned, as he watched the dark wall of what he now understood was the whale itself sank back down, stopping just a foot or so above proper sea level. Henry's limbs were heavy with exhaustion, but he forced them to carry him ever backwards, away from the cursed sea. All along the border between the sea and the ocean, tentacles rose up. They reached out and swept through the ocean waves, probing. The whale was looking for him. When he felt his back hit something hard, he let out a thin scream. He splashed in place, twisting to look over his shoulder. Behind him, an old boy danced in the shallow waves, its light long dead. His whole body shaking, Henry wrapped his arms around one of the buoy's thick, salt-eaten struts. He looked back the way he'd come. The tentacle directly in front of him was swirling its tip through his dinner. More tentacles rose out of the depths to join it, first exploring the vomit, then sweeping from side to side in great arcs. There was no way the whale could reach him, he half prayed, half reasoned. There was no way. The tentacles, finding nothing, expanded their search in wider arcs. Henry held his breath, tried not to move. The tentacles stretched and stretched. His heart burst into a painful palpitation as one swept past, mere feet from where the boy floated. Then the tentacles relaxed into the water and were sucked back into its endless flank. From afar, Henry watched as the border of black sank back down to sea level and grew still. To the east, the horizon began to lighten as the sun prepared to rise. The cold waters lapped around Henry's waist in a playful dance. He relished the clean touch, even as his body temperature dropped and he began to shiver violent spasms. He tightened his arms around the strut and rested his head against the metal. No one would come for him. All the ships would be turning back with the dawn. The hunts only happened at night, when the whale was most active. Henry was stranded, at least until the next night. Henry? He tensed, every muscle sparking. That voice sounded familiar, but that would be impossible. Please. In the pale dawn light, Henry scanned the ocean, but it wasn't true. It couldn't be true. And yet, there she was, struggling in the black sea, treading the oily liquid, but just barely. Lena? Henry? Her voice carried over the waves in a faint plea. A violent shiver ripped through Henry's body, part chill, part terror. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the distant horizon as if, by some miracle, help would be coming from the direction of the open sea. I can't. Please, she called to him. A colder wave of shame rolled over him as memories of sharing meals sparked to life in his mind. As he remembered the face of her daughter in the photo she carried with her always. What kind of person would he be if he didn't even try to save her? With that new determination flaring as a hot, white flame inside his chest, Henry began to swim toward the edge of the Black Sea. A foot or so from the thickly glistening being, Henry treaded in place and watched. The whale was stilled, its massive, miles-long, gelatinous body quiet once more. The coming of dawn had put it back to its daylight slumber. Henry took a deep, shuddering breath. His body was trembling with the faint remains of adrenaline, fear, and exhaustion. But he thought he could make it. She was only a half-dozen feet from him. As he looked to her, he saw her raise a hand towards him, though it quickly dropped below sea level again, and she sunk a bit. "Elena!" And then he was plunging forward, cutting through the thick, viscous entity with strong front strokes, kicking furiously. How sensitive was it? Was it like a spider, instantly aware of when prey touched any part of its dark web? Would it sense him swimming desperately through its very body and attack? It didn't matter. In another moment he was there. He was in front of Elena. He reached for her, found one arm to grip. A smile broke across his face. And then he froze. The sun had risen higher, and now he could see clearly. Elena was leaning back, her head tilted to the right, and her already scarred face almost fully destroyed by the hungry touch of the whale. Her eyes had melted partially and stared sightlessly up. Elena's mouth was slack, her lips gone, and still he heard his name being called. He had to look. He could see in the brightening light that her skin was completely eaten away across her chest and shoulders. The arm he couldn't find was actually still there, but it had been reduced to mere bones, loosely connected by stubborn sinew, still attached to her ragged left shoulder, where gristle and muscle were exposed. As he watched, he heard his name again, and as he did, he saw her throat vibrate. A pressure that felt like a sinuous tongue wrapped around his legs. His shoulders slumped. He gritted his teeth as his body began to tingle, then prickle, then burn. The pain was unbearable. He didn't want to think what was happening to his skin. From the chest down, his body was on fire. His legs were now completely without feeling. In Elena's mouth, he could see clever little appendages coiled in her throat and nestled around her tongue. These dark, eldritch limbs shivered, and as they did, he heard it again. Henry. He felt a burning in his eyes, this time from tears rather than the acid that was digesting him. The whale was intelligent. It must have entered through her chest or belly or somewhere else and applied delicate tendrils against her vocal cords in order to mimic her voice. Henry felt a gentle tug at his waist, playfully pulling him deeper. He reached for Elena, and a dark swell rose in response, raising the half-digested, soggy right arm of Elena with it. He had to wonder, was the whale mocking him? The mound cradled her arm as delicately as Elena had likely cradled her daughter so many nights before, and the whale nudged her body closer so Henry could just barely grasp Elena's finger bones. Weakened by digestive juices, they broke off in his hand with a soft crackle. And then the whale pulled him under. Henry managed to grab a last gasp of air, but he did not struggle. Clutching the fragments of bone in a fist held against his disintegrating chest, Henry tilted his head back and forced his eyes open. In the mere second it took for the destructive black waters to melt his eyes from his sockets, he saw the cheerful rosy glow of ripening daybreak cast a golden hue across the shifting surface of the whale. Then he was plunged into darkness and pain. Pamela McMillan's The Whale Hunts. Oh yes, it certainly does. If you enjoyed this story, then be sure to check out That Which the Ocean Gives and Takes Away, which we featured in episode 77, and Godmouth, which we featured in episode 96, both of which were penned by the marvelous Miss McMillan. And of course, you can find links to even more of her work on our website, nocturnaltransmissions.com.au. Just visit our featured authors page. She's right at the top of page 2. So, there we have it, our first transmission of 2022. Oh my, what a futuristic-sounding year that is. 2022. I wonder what unexpected marvels we'll be witness to in this age of wonders. Suppose we'll just have to wait and see. Get busy, Mr. Musk. The robot apocalypse isn't going to start itself, you know. Or is it? Anyway, this episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our Patreon subscribers. A particular thank you goes out to our esteemed cohorts. Michael Wood, Evan Dooley, Sam Bell, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Alex Brewis, Barry Jones, Alicia Townsend, Stephanie Soloka, J.B., Rachel Brown, Adam, Abaddon, Joe Stinson, Eugene Petrie, Wayne Prince, Stephen Andrews, Arnie Frank, Tippy Polo, Sam Hankins, Juliana Rance, Fox Meets Bear, and Philip Abruzese. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. If you'd like to support our humble production and reap the rewards with which we intend to repay your largesse, just visit patreon.com/Nocturnal Transmissions and sign up. You can be a member of our exclusive clique for as little as $2 a month. Our big, fat back catalogue of Patreon-exclusive, terrifying tales is only a few clicks away. All right, I think we've wasted quite enough of your valuable time. Until next we meet, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone. Especially yourself. Good night, gentle